afternoon. My name is Steve Hernandez, and I'm the Executive Director of the Legislature's Nonpartisan Commission on Women, Children, Seniors, Equity, and Opportunity. We are here today at a virtual forum to discuss aging in the community in Connecticut. For the last several years now, Connecticut has dedicated itself to being a home to our aging community in the state that is welcoming, accessible, and safe. Today, we are joined by a star-studded panel of experts and leaders in the space who will be walking with us through what a more open and accessible community for our aging population can and will look like for the state of Connecticut. Without anything further, I would love to welcome Dianne Stone, the director of the Newington Senior and Disabled Center, who will also serve as our moderator for today's conversation. Welcome, Dianne, and we're excited for you to introduce our panelists today.
Thanks a lot, Stephen. Good afternoon, everybody. I'm going to provide a little bit of context for today's conversation. Aging in the community. It's a really broad term. Of course, we're all aging in the community. The conversation around aging often focuses on the people who receive long-term services and supports, often in congregate settings like nursing homes or assisted living, and they're aging in the community. And there's a lot of important conversations that need to happen around long-term care, especially in light of COVID. For today's discussion, we're going to focus more on how people are aging in the community outside of these congregate settings, in their homes and in our cities and towns. And this is not a new conversation. We've had community-based services in place since the early 60s with federal, state, and local support. And we're going to talk about some of those. Connecticut has also fully embraced rebalancing its long-term care system so that more people are able to live in the home of their choice, receiving services outside of congregate settings. We're going to talk a bit about that too. In 2013, recognizing the unprecedented longevity in Connecticut's population, coupled with just sheer increases in the number of older adults, the Connecticut General Assembly charged what was then the Legislative Commission on Aging with facilitating a Livable Communities initiative. Through that initiative, we learned a lot about how to create communities that are age-friendly, walkability, healthcare and social services, and how people engage in the community. We're not going to address all of those areas today, but I am happy to say that this work of livability is continuing in Connecticut. The Connecticut Age Well Collaborative has been established to guide a comprehensive analysis of aging in Connecticut, to create a sustainable cross-sector and public-private structure that will amplify, align, and coordinate local, regional, and statewide efforts towards an age and dementia-friendly Connecticut. This collaborative is guided by a steering committee that, among other people, includes all of the people on the panel here today, including the Commission on Women, Children, Seniors, Equity, and Opportunity, and has Connecticut Community Care serving as the backbone organization. This work has really just started, and with the generous support of the Tufts Health Plan Foundation, we're starting the ball rolling. So I'm sure that we're going to have more discussions about the Age Well Collaborative and all of the robust work that goes into that in the future. But for today, we have our panelists, and each of them is going to tell us a little bit about what they do and about what changed in what they do during COVID. And because we do believe that this pandemic is going to end someday, we are going to come out of the other end of this. We want to talk about what a post-COVID world might look like for us. What are the lasting impacts, challenges? What are the positives? What did we learn? And what do we need to do from a funding and policy perspective as we move forward? As we talk, I'd encourage you to post comments or questions in the comment section. Our friend Claire Cote from Aging and Disability Services is monitoring that for us. And if she can't answer your question, she'll make sure that it gets to the right panelists so that we can. So with that, I wanted to turn it over to, and I actually don't have the list of the titles, but you all know who you are, so I'm going to let you introduce yourself. But first up, we're going to hear from Margie Girondo-Marquette from Aging and Disability Services. Go ahead, Margie.
Thanks, Diane. Yes, I'm a program manager with the State Unit on Aging from the State Department of Aging and Disability Services. I want to thank the Commission, Stephen, and his staff for putting this together and hosting, and Diane for moderating. And it's great to be here with all of my colleagues on the panel. We've worked together for years on aging issues. And this feels like a really good time to pause and reflect on what has happened so far during the pandemic and lessons learned and what's to come in the future. So a little bit about the State Unit on Aging. We're one of many agencies that provide services to older adults, that support services for older adults living in the community. We know that most older adults want to live at home for as long as possible. And with our funding through the Older Americans Act and our state funds, we look to provide these crucial supports for helping people stay healthy and independent in nutrition, senior employment, health promotion, caregiver support, health insurance counseling. And I just want to highlight two of those programs. One is the Elderly Nutrition Program that provides home delivered meals and congregate meals at sites like senior centers. And we provided almost 2 million meals last year to 21,000 people. In our other program, our Choices program, which I hope a lot of you are familiar with, it does health insurance counseling with its network of professionals and volunteers, counseled 27,000 Medicare beneficiaries last year. So we're really, really excited about that. So the way we get our funds to the community is we receive Federal Older Americans Act and some other funds and state funds. And the bulk of those funds go through the State Unit on Aging to the area agencies on aging, who then through a competitive process fund community agencies to provide those services at a local level. And I think it's important to note that we're not the only state agency that provides services to older adults. For example, the Department of Social Services has the Connecticut Home Care Program for elders. They've got the Protective Services for the elderly, and Medicaid, that is certainly a program that supports older folks. The Department of Mental Health and Addiction Services provides mental health services through their Senior Outreach and Engagement Program. So together, many state agencies serve older adults in the community. And I just want to put a little plug in for our state plan on aging. We started our new state plan October 1st. It's a 3-year plan. It's our roadmap for aging services for the future. The plan was developed over the course of the year, mostly pre-pandemic, with input from the community. And our goals are around long-term services and supports, healthy aging, and elder rights. So shifting gears to talk about what has changed for us during the pandemic. I mean, COVID-19 has really tested our aging network infrastructure and our emergency plans too, our continuity of operation plans. When we were faced with the pandemic, we put our emergency plans into place and learned that there were some things that weren't in there that we learned about that now we can add. So many services during the pandemic continued, although they were provided differently. Providers in the community have adapted and reimagined services to provide supports to older adults to keep people safe and healthy. And the community itself, which you'll hear about today, stepped up to support each other, delivering groceries, checking in on neighbors. So for the State Unit on Aging, we received both Families First and CARES Act federal funding for meals, as well as other Older Americans Act services during the pandemic. And for Families First, we received $2.7 million specifically for meals. And for CARES Act funding, we received $8.8 million, and more than half of that was for meals. And these funds came with some really important flexibilities. And through the governor's major disaster declaration and executive orders, we had even more flexibilities in how we used our funding and shifted how we provided our services so that, for example, we could allow grab and go meals at a senior center instead of that traditional sit down congregate meal, which was no longer an option during the pandemic. And we could reimburse adult day centers for remote services when centers were closed to the public. So during the pandemic, meals continued to be available to people through our partners, the AAAs and the elderly nutrition providers. Home delivered meals continued. The demand was met for the increased number of meals. The congregate meals shifted to grab and go and also delivered meals, and those demands were met. There were backup plans put in place with shelf-stable meals so that if a meal couldn't be delivered, people still had a meal as part of that backup plan. Meals weren't the only critical need as we saw during the pandemic, and critical needs just included food access issues, included social isolation. For food access, there was a need for groceries. We saw the need for grocery shopping, grocery delivery, the food itself. Various agencies stepped up to meet that need, and using our CARES Act funds and our flexibilities, the AAAs developed grocery bag projects, which were able to help with this need as well. And then finally, social isolation. This was not a new issue when we went into the pandemic, but the pandemic put a spotlight on it because it became an even more serious concern. And agencies looked for ways to address social isolation. And I want to acknowledge the critical role that senior center staff like Dianne played in keeping in touch with people and keeping people engaged. And for our part, the State Union on Aging staff developed a project called Stay Connected using some CARES Act funds, and it addresses social isolation in part through technology. It screens for those at high risk, connects them with someone who can help them with some training and a device. And we know that with a tablet or other device that people can connect to telehealth services, they can connect with family and friends, which will be so important during these holidays. And like virtual online programming, like exercise programs through a senior center, and so many opportunities so they stay engaged, stay active while they're at home. So that's pretty much a summary of what shifted during the pandemic. And Dianne, I'll send it back to you.
Thank you so much. And we're going to talk a little bit afterwards. We're going to have a discussion after each panelist has spoken and reflect on some of the things that we've talked about. But I'd now like to turn it over to Maureen McIntyre, who's representing the Area Agencies on Aging in the state, an important part of the Older Americans Act Aging Services Network. And Maureen, take it away.
Okay. Thank you, Dianne. And as Margie said, I'd like to echo that thanks to the Commission and to you, Dianne, for moderating today. It's really wonderful to be here. It does feel a bit like an old home days of sorts. We've all had the opportunity to present together so much. This is a really nice opportunity, and I'm really glad that we're taking the time. I know the Commission has a broad swath of responsibility, so I'm very happy today that we're focusing on aging. And as a matter of fact, just to take a quick second, when the Commission on Aging became the Commission on Women, Children, Seniors, Equity, and Opportunity, I think that we didn't yet know how important that intersectionality would be, that the issues that affect one group so very well speak to all. So I really do appreciate the work that the Commission has done in elevating the concerns of everyone. And, we say that tongue in cheek at times, but it really has been a really important partnership. And I think something that I think we'll talk about in a little bit more detail later. But just as a quick description of the Area Agencies on Aging, there are 5 of us across the state. I'm happy to be here today to represent my colleagues from the other areas. You'll know Marie Allen from Bridgeport, Mike Hebert from Waterbury, Melissa Lang from New Haven, and Joan Wessel from Norwich. So between the 5 of us, everything that you'll hear me speak about today is replicable and is currently taking place. And for those of you that may be watching that are not familiar with Area Agencies on Aging, we are all private nonprofit organizations. And as there are 5 of us here in Connecticut, there are over 620 of us nationally. So for those of you that are, riveted and glued to your Facebook right now thinking, oh my goodness, everything I'm hearing today is brand new and wonderful, for family members that live in other places, these services are available to them too. And I would imagine that their experiences are quite similar. So this is something that isn't unique to Connecticut. The Area Agencies on Aging are national and very happy to be so. The foundation of the Older Americans Act, which is really our origin story. The area agencies on aging came into being out of a recognition that Older Americans Act funds really needed to be deployed directly into the communities that had the greatest opportunity to decide what those priorities would be and to put the funding where it was most needed. And so from the beginning, our populations have always been the most at risk. We focus primarily on low-income minority people, communities of color, older women, people who are isolated, whether it's culturally or by geography, rural older adults, for example, people that may be experiencing an isolation based on dementia or cultural capability. These have from the very beginning been our target populations, folks that were traditionally perhaps left behind. And unfortunately, as obviously things have played out, these populations continue to be the most disproportionately affected by our current COVID pandemic. So from our perspective, kind of boots on the ground, a lot of the things that we're seeing as a result of the pandemic, we all of us here on this call kind of already knew about, as Margie mentioned, food insecurity, social isolation, availability of accessible and affordable housing, issues of safety. These were things that were present before, but unfortunately with the pandemic, the episodes, the sheer volume, the number of people who were newly introduced to these issues, people who had never perhaps experienced food insecurity. Now it's becoming more part of their reality. People who may have been active in their communities, but are now on stay-at-home orders. So we're seeing an entirely new population having to deal with what some communities have been experiencing for a very long time. So in terms of what the area agencies on aging have done in this space, is sort of try to begin to address a lot of these social determinants of health. Margie very eloquently talked about nutrition. That has definitely been, one of our primary focal points, for the last 8 months, although it seems like decades. Just trying to make sure that we're able to address these things as they arise. So clearly nutrition, transportation services, housing, employment, these are all things that, we had always kind of had an eye on, but clearly under these circumstances, really kind of rose to the level of emergent. And what we saw as a kind of an interesting dichotomy, we play a couple different roles in the community. We're at once a funding organization, all 5 of us, and we're also providers of direct service. The vast majority of funds that we take in from the Older Americans Act goes right back out into the community to fund those things like transportation programs, Live Well programs, Meals on Wheels, in-home support services. Everybody that last year heading into Christmas had provided the area agencies on aging with proposals for that coming year, saw their business plans and saw all of their wonderful grant proposals turn in a heartbeat. Assessments, support groups, medical transportation, adult daycare services changed on a dime. Almost overnight, we went from serving people to having to come up with completely different business models and modes of delivery for all of these services. We figured out quickly how to, I'm going to say the word pivot, even though I think we've all become so frustrated with the word pivot that we're falling all the time, as Dianne likes to say. But we did. We figured out how to go from providing one kind of service in the home to providing something totally different, whether it was virtually or telephonically, whether it was now by a volunteer or a paid staff who was now operating from our homes. We all had to figure out in very short order how to make sure that the services were still delivered, but perhaps in a completely different and yet unimagined way. We saw a new vocabulary around health and human services. We had to develop all of a sudden, well, we've got all of this CARES Act and Families First money, like Margie talked about, but how exactly do we bill for this? a lot of this didn't exist. We had to come up with codes for masks. Whoever thought that an area agency on aging would be paying for masks and other forms of PPE, which was a new term of art that we had to learn. All of a sudden, as Margie said, grocery bags. We had a couple of regions of the state that were hit early and quickly with the pandemic. They knew they needed to get groceries into the hands of people. And the best way to do that was by dropping off grocery bags and distributing through these amazing networks of volunteers. Some of us needed to do a more surgical approach and just focus on a rural community within elderly housing, or provide shopping services for people who were low income but had previously been able to access food pantries. So having that coordination and having that flexibility and that creativity arguably was one of the things that we'll look back on as perhaps an innovation, perhaps something that we don't want to lose sight of. We also don't want to lose sight of the impact that this has had on family caregivers. For those of you that are familiar with the movie Spinal Tap, let's just say that the caregiver stress got turned up to 11. Whether you were quarantining together or isolating separately, we saw families stretched to the max. We saw bandwidth, both literally and figuratively, having to keep up with new demands on devices and new demands on caregiver time. So a lot of the support systems that we knew we had in place found themselves sorely tested as families now struggled to stay home, teach their kids, monitor their college-bound and suddenly returning children, as well as their older adults that are now in the community and may or may not have had the support that they had originally. So we found very quickly that there was safety and comfort in numbers. The partnerships that were developed, the collaborations that were developed, these were all things that changed. And again, hopefully, as we talk a little bit more about our goals for the future, these are things that will continue. But we continue also to struggle with a capacity for all of us. You know, I think as frontline staff, as grantees, we are seeing the toll that this has taken, both on families in the community, but also on the infrastructure, the safety net that Margie talked about. As a result of the pandemic, we lost one of our key foundational building blocks of respite care, which is adult day centers. Many were able to pivot to that new business model and provide things, you know, more remotely and provide a hot meal. But by the same token, we lost adult daycare centers who just could not keep their doors open. And that's a loss that the network is going to feel for a really long time. So from the Area Agency on Aging perspective, we're so proud to have been able to do what we were able to do. We are humbled by what this showed us in terms of the gaps and how far we still need to go. And I'm very happy that we'll continue the conversation once I'm finished throughout the rest of the panel with where we go from here and some of our opportunities for those partnerships and collaborations. So thank you very much.
Thanks, Maureen. So I'm moderating this panel as a member of the Commission on Women, Children, Seniors, Equity, and Opportunity. I'm also sitting on the panel as the director of the Newington Senior and Disabled Center and the president of the Connecticut Association of Senior Centers. So I'm going to take my turn as a panelist now. And there are currently more than 160 senior centers in Connecticut. I cannot name their directors. I can't go down the list. But there are quite a few of us. Almost every municipality has a senior center. And senior centers, the modern senior center was started in the 1940s out of the Bronx, New York. And they were really started to address malnutrition and isolation among community dwelling older adults. That was in the 40s. They're really locally driven organizations that have evolved over time to include things like transportation, social services, information referral, recreation, fitness, wellness, and so on. Back in October 2011, we had that big snowstorm, and everybody remembers the snowstorm, October snowstorm. And we were caught a little bit flat-footed, right? We learned a lot from that, and we spent a lot of time coming up with our emergency plans and learning how to take care of people in an emergency. And you know what? We can put together a shelter like that, and shelters don't help in a pandemic. So again, we were caught a little bit flat-footed without a plan for what to do. So in Connecticut, the first and usually the last line of defense for people is their municipality. And that was true for senior centers as well in the pandemic. And I've got to say, I am just so impressed that senior centers across the state, and we do have an association, we are connected in some ways to the area agencies on aging and to the state. And believe me, it looks different, just like many things in Connecticut. It looks different depending on where you are. But I am so impressed that senior centers across the state and on their own all moved in the same direction when the pandemic hit. March 13th, the doors closed. By March 16th, senior centers were making phone calls and they were doing wellness checks, reaching out to the people in their community to see how they were. Immediately after, we had to look at nutrition because, again, we go back to our core: social isolation and malnutrition. Thankfully, the state and the area agencies and the elderly nutrition providers were able to very quickly get up and running alternative services to our congregate meals and develop grab-and-go lunches. And we developed locally the systems to get those to the people as quickly as we could. We developed things like grocery shopping programs. We learned how to do things like use video technology. We started Zoom programs, exercise, social, lifelong learning programs. And this is a challenge. A lot of centers didn't have the technology or didn't have the knowledge to be able to put these programs in place. So really banded together. We started having more frequent meetings and sharing and collaborating things with each other. We worked with the Connecticut Healthy Living Collective to offer things like the Aging Mastery Program virtually. We were one of the first areas of the country to be able to do that. And we're currently creating a virtual senior center program through the support of AARP with a marquee event called It's a Wonderful Life, a Holiday Bash. We have more than 70 senior centers signed up for that. And currently more than 1,000 people are registered to participate. So we learned quickly, though, that Zoom programs are wonderful, but that if we wanted to reach people, we needed to get a high-tech, a high-tech, things like our Zoom programs. We needed low-tech approaches, things like conference call programs, and we needed no-tech. So you'll see senior centers across the state doing things like drive-through events. We just had a drive-through Thanksgiving event today, doing parades and so on. A lot of things to try to connect with people in the community. Because we have learned that even with the great programs that we have in place, just the lack of physical activity that people are getting and the lack of community connection that they're getting that would have naturally come from moving about the community are having a toll on people. So we are really trying hard to reach people and to make sure that they stay connected. We also worked with the state when it looked like we might be able to start letting people back into our buildings to establish sector guidelines for senior centers. That's something that hadn't been contemplated. It was a little bit challenging because senior centers are not very well known or understood. They don't often factor into some of these plans, but we were able to have guidelines published for senior centers. Some of the things that we've learned for this are just the incredible value and potential of senior centers and their importance in the community. The incredible value of collaboration, both with other senior centers. We're now cross-promoting programs, building on the strengths and really building efficiencies to improve services for people. A lot of the gaps that exist in technology. And Maureen talked about I think it was Maureen, it might've been Margie that talked about the Staying Connected program. There are a lot of people that don't have internet connected devices. There are also a lot of people that have no interest in internet connected devices that are never going to get on a Zoom program. So we have to be aware of how we can reach people. And one of the things that I continue to be impressed by, and probably why I work in this field, is the absolute resilience of the older adults that we work with who are surviving this pandemic. And they may not be thriving. I don't know that anybody is thriving right now. but they are absolutely surviving, and they show us every day that this is something that we will get through, and that at the end of it, we're all going to be all right. So I'm going to turn it over now to, and we're shifting gears slightly, because we know that there's a lot of people living independently in the community that don't require services beyond maybe nutrition and transportation, but that actually need some in-home services. So I'm going to turn it over to Julie Evans-Starr and let her explain what she's going to explain. Go ahead, Julie.
Oh, thanks, Diane. Hello, everyone. Good afternoon. I also want to thank Stephen and the Commission for helping support and pull this together. It's a really important conversation. So my name is Julie Evans-Starr. As Diane said, I'm the president of Connecticut Community Care. And our mission is to provide choice and services to people of all ages, abilities, ethnicities, and incomes. We really want to help people be able to live at home. And proudly, this has been CCC's mission for over 40 years. So what we do is we have a really strong team of care managers, transition and housing coordinators, and others who provide an array of short and long-term care management services and self-directed support for older adults and people with disabilities. So we see ourselves as a partner, a problem solver, a mediator, a navigator, among other things, to really help people be able to stay and thrive in their homes and communities. Margie, Diane, I think everyone so far has mentioned the role of community and how very important that is. CCC has worked with the collective impact framework to work with our partners to really lock arms and make sure that there's a certain degree of readiness on the community's behalf. And so more to come on that, and perhaps for another time. My role, as Diane said, was to talk about long-term services and supports in the community. So pardon me if I get a little weedy or wonky, or just pull me out altogether. This is where my passion lies. So I don't want to go too far into it, but hopefully everybody watching knows that long-term services and supports represents, and what it means is it's the broad range of health-related and social services that people might need over weeks or months or years to be able to live at home with help with their activities of daily living. So an individual might have a challenge due to a physical or cognitive or mental health condition or a disability, and how can we best support that person in their home? Now, typically when you hear long-term services and supports, you might think nursing homes. But it's true, LTSS, which we call it, really supports people in a variety of settings. CCC is an access agency. What does that mean? Well, we're one of a few other access agencies in the state. We have the very good fortune of being the largest. We serve something like 16,000 folks in a year. And we contract with the Department of Social Services to be an access agency. So even though we work with Margie's department at the State Unit on Aging, there are a variety of state agencies we work with, as well as the other access agencies. But this designation of being an access agency is through the Department of Social Services, who is the state Medicaid agency. And they contract with us to provide comprehensive care management services for their Medicaid members. So you could be on one of the Medicaid waivers. The Connecticut Home Care Program is the largest one people mostly talk about. You could be a participant of Community First Choice, or you could be somebody on the Money Follows the Person program. So that being said, that means that the majority of the people that we support are at nursing home level of care. So these are folks that need a significant amount of service and supports to be able to be in the community. Now, Medicare does cover some of that, but primarily Medicaid is the primary payer of long-term services and supports, whether you're in a nursing home or in the community. And of course, it goes without saying that the family caregiver, again, the informal structure is really the backbone and is somewhat unsung in this regard, but for another time. So what I wanted to mention was rebalancing and why it's really important with what's happening specific to COVID. So for the last 20 plus years, there has been a shift in energy from having Medicaid pay for long-term service and support, specifically in the institution. And now there has been a movement over the last 20 years to help support people in the community. Why is that so? It's because it's what people want. If you ask, they want to be able to receive services and supports in their homes, to stay there. It's also a rights issue. There was a US Supreme Court decision in 1999, I believe it was, called Olmstead, that gave people the right to use those Medicaid dollars to be able to receive them in their homes and communities. And there's a lot of conversation about cost savings as well. Does it cost less to receive those services in your community? So that's what's happening with rebalancing. It's happening on a national level and in Connecticut. Now, Connecticut is a real leader in this regard. As a matter of fact, a colleague just told me that they earned the Pacesetter Award from the SCAN Foundation recently toward affordability and accessibility. So there's real momentum happening and has been for the last 20 years. My concern is that COVID might derail some of those efforts. You know, the adverse effects of COVID are so very real and stinging to all of us that do this work and have for many, many years. Our hearts go out to the families and the individuals, older adults and people with disabilities. Unfortunately, stating the obvious, they've been disproportionately hit. They have experienced severe complications. They have higher mortality. There's a disruptive aspect to their daily routines, and of course the isolation that we've talked about. Our concern, you know, my colleagues and I, is that, and has long been a concern, that this becomes our norm, that this is somewhat accepted, that we're desensitized to the fact that older adults and people with disabilities are in great part bearing the brunt of this. And we hope that's not the case. That's also the discussion that's happening and what's happening in nursing homes across the state. That work is so very important. I know well the state long-term care ombudsman. You know, you talk about some change that has happened that can be positive. She has she's been a leader. She's been out front. She's been talking about these issues, whether it's Facebook Live, engaging with the governor's office, embracing families, having them go to her. I mean, she works with Margie. She's been extraordinary. And there's a lot of energy and attention devoted to that. And I think Anna's going to talk about that after me, so I'll move on from that. But just in terms of how the access agencies have responded, I can speak on behalf of Connecticut Community Care. The Department of Social Service has been so transparent. We meet with them on a weekly basis. How can we best help our clients? And there's been some flexibility that's happened in terms of some provisions on Medicaid to ensure continuity of care. There's been wellness checks. We're using data-driven solutions. I know data isn't sexy, but it's so very important in driving the decisions in any targeted intervention, especially specific to COVID. For example, when there was a shortage of PPE and you only have so much, how do you know where to get the PPE to the clients that are at most risk? Well, we use the data to tell the story, and that was with the help of the UConn Health Center on Aging. So there are a variety of ways that we can, get to the target population that needs the most support and are at risk. And that's perhaps a positive in how we've seen data used and hopefully moving forward as well. There's been a full court press with Money Follows the Person. How do we help people in nursing homes be able to transition from the nursing home back into the community? There's a lot of creativity happening, a lot of flexibility. And I think it was Maureen who said that we hope that some of that flexibility and the ability to be nimble kind of carries with us post-COVID. So I see you nodding your head vehemently, Diane. I think that means I should wrap up. I'm going to pitch it to you because I do want to hear what Anna has to say, and I'm hoping there's some dialogue and some questions, and we can hear from people and maybe get some really great ideas as well. So I'm going to stop talking.
Thanks. No, Julie, actually, I was nodding my head in agreement.
Okay.
Yeah. I'd make another sign like this or something if it was okay. Stop talking. Sure, I was purely, no, I absolutely agree. And, the people on this panel, this is not the first time we've been in a room together and had conversations. And we have passionate conversations about a lot of this stuff. And having it be, one person, and not be able to jump in and go, yeah, I agree with that, right, and another thing. So it's hard to show some restraint in having a conversation like this. You started to talk a little bit about, and we'll probably get to, all of us have spent our careers fighting against ageism and portraying older adults as adults and not as people in a post-adult phase of life, and fighting ableism and seeing people with disabilities as vital, important, and productive members of the community. Not that production equals citizenship. And one of the things that COVID has done, the first thing we said was, if you're an older adult or a person with disability, you need to stay home. And if you stay home, everybody. So we'll probably get to more of that. But the nodding was okay. Passionate agreement with what you're saying. But I do want to turn it over now to Anna DOROGHAZI. And Anna's going to talk a little bit about AARP and kind of get us into a bit more of a policy discussion. So Anna, it's all yours.
All right. Thank you so much, Diane. And thank you to Stephen and the Commission for hosting us today, and to everybody for all of your great comments. So AARP is in a little bit different of a position than the other folks who are part of this conversation, in that we're not a direct service organization. So what we are is a nonpartisan, nonprofit social mission organization that advocates for individuals age 50 and older. So nationwide, we have about 38 million members and just under 600,000 members here in Connecticut. So we do a lot of advocacy at the state and federal level on issues that matter most to older adults. And we focus in particular on making sure that people have choices. One of our mottos is we help people choose how they live as they age. Which is a really relevant piece for us to keep in mind with any policy discussions related to COVID. Diane just mentioned that one of the themes we've seen in this pandemic is this urge to protect older adults. And I think, as a society, we have this bad tendency to think that protect means to put aside. We're going to keep you safe over here, where we want to make sure that older adults and everyone have real choices to stay engaged in the community and to be involved and to be active. And that's one of the ways that AARP is really approaching and framing, our policy work all the time, but especially now, in light of the pandemic. So in terms of, what's changed for AARP and how we do our work, pre-pandemic, we were in the community constantly. We do a lot of events and membership engagement that we like to call fun with purpose. So we like to create opportunities for AARP members to come and join us in the community, maybe, have a fun day at a museum or, at a tourist attraction or, a great place in Connecticut. And while we're there, we're going to make sure that you have information, about policy issues that we're working on or about other things that, we have going on advocacy-wise. We have some great educational programs that are mostly volunteer-led. We have a fraud watch program, something we call the Caregiver Roadshow. We have programs about understanding what your electric bill means and making sure that you're not paying higher rates than you should be. So immediately, back in March, we had to shift all of those events and all of that programming online. And I think there are some misconceptions about the ability of older adults, to be tech savvy. And, what we found was that, many of our members are great at those virtual engagements. But again, not everyone is. So we've had to be really creative about how do we make sure that we're still trying to reach audiences who aren't comfortable working in virtual environments. So advocacy-wise, AARP does advocacy work on both the state and federal level. So while Dianne, Maureen, and Julie, and the folks at the State Unit on Aging are doing the really in the weeds, direct face-to-face work, a lot of our policy work is focused on how do we create structures that allow those face-to-face interactions to be more successful and to really do what they're setting out to do. So, on the federal level, two big issues that we're looking at right now, one is around Social Security. The pandemic, it might not seem like there's a direct connection between Social Security and COVID-19, but the way that the Social Security Administration calculates your initial benefit is looking at the country's wages, something they call the National Average Wage Index. So the Social Security Administration looks at the wage index the year that workers turn 60 and adjust their benefits based on those wages. So for the 4 million Americans who are turning 60 this year, the national average wage has been reduced because of COVID. So what this means is over the course of a worker's lifetime, they could lose up to $70,000 in Social Security retirement benefits unless Congress takes some action through another COVID package and holds beneficiaries harmless from the drop that we're seeing in 2020 average wages due to COVID-19. So that's just one example federally. Here on the state level, I think one of the advocacy challenges that we see right now is that it's so easy to be reactive. So much policy is reactive policy. And it's really tempting to come up with ideas for things that we wish we had had in place in February of 2020. But something that I've been thinking about a lot and what I'm trying to challenge other people to think about, as we move into the 2021 legislative session, is that we can't plan for February of 2020. We need to be looking ahead and thinking policy-wise, where do we want to be in 5 years, in 10 years, in 20 years? And that's where, a lot of the pieces of the conversation today really come into play. Do we need to have really intense policy conversations right now about nursing homes? Yes, we absolutely do. More than 60% of Connecticut's COVID deaths took place in nursing homes. We have to focus on testing PPE, ending civil immunity for nursing facilities. There are a lot of issues there, but that focusing on nursing homes can't cause us to lose focus on the fact that there are a lot of other ways that people receive long-term services and supports, and a lot of other ways that people want to receive those services. So AARP, just recently put out some great research. We did a lot of national survey work and found that only 6% of people say that they want to receive care in a nursing home as they age. Another 11% or so think they want to receive care in an assisted living facility. But everyone else, when you ask, what does your ideal, aging look like? They want to receive care in a home setting and have that care provided. Really been active in rebalancing, taking more people out of facility-based care and moving them into home and community-based settings. And most people, in this recent AARP survey, still have a generally favorable perception of nursing homes. 45% of people say that COVID has had a negative impact on their opinion, is making them more likely to want to age in the community. And I think we just always need to come back to what do people want? And that has to be the starting place for our planning and for our advocacy. So if people are saying, I want to stay in the community, we need to make sure that there are adequate services available. And we also need to look at features of the community holistically. So for example, a quarter of adults say their home isn't equipped to help them age in place. What are policy choices that can do something about that? Do we have zoning codes that allow things like accessory dwelling units, for example, where somebody could, move into a son or daughter's backyard? Can we, have tax policies that incentivize accessible home renovations? 15% of folks say they don't think they're going to be able to stay in their community as they age because of a lack of community services. So, we're coming into a budget year. how can we look at that and say, okay, what do we need to fund? We know that there's great success for the Connecticut Home Care Program for elders. We know that adult day and respite services are absolutely critical for Connecticut's 460,000 family caregivers. People need transportation. They need, a healthy home health workforce. So I just tossed out a lot of stuff that was not a coherent policy vision, but more kind of a high level way to, I guess, kick the conversation back to the group, because I know I always love talking to all of you. So I want to make sure we have just a little bit of time for that conversation to happen now that I've, just dumped a whole bunch of ideas out for you.
Thanks a lot, Anna. And like I said, once we get talking passionately, and it's hard to keep any kind of guardrails up about the topic because everything is interconnected. We said at the outset that the Connecticut Age Well Collaborative, a lot of the stuff that Anna's talking about right now are the very things that we're going to be looking at. There's a consultant has been engaged to start doing some of the asset mapping and some of the research around best practices and really trying to move some of those things forward. Incredibly important work for Connecticut and for not just older adults, but for the entire population. So we really look forward to moving on with that. And we wanted to spend a little bit of time now. We talked kind of about what we're doing and what we did during COVID. And, we'll probably continue to debrief about what we did in COVID. It's been 8 months, so it's debriefing on, probably a whole year's worth of stuff. But we wanted to talk a little bit about post-COVID. So many things were created or adapted or otherwise changed during COVID. And in many ways, COVID accelerated changes that we had already contemplated. It forced us and allowed us to move in directions that we might have thought about before. Like the whole concept of remote programs, so doing Zoom exercise and aging mastery program virtually. We always knew that there were people that couldn't come to our buildings, that couldn't come into our centers for these in-person programs, maybe because of transportation, because of health issues or caregiving duties. And we didn't know how to reach them. But now we've set up systems and we know that there's options available. So it would not make sense for us to step out of those and not continue to offer them. And I know, Margie, you had talked about flexibility. With a program like the Elderly Nutrition Program, there's not a lot of flexibility built into the Older Americans Act, but the CARES Act allowed you to do some things like grab and go meals. And so I'm just wondering if we can all kind of share a little bit about maybe what is going forward, what stands out to you, what stays post-COVID? Margie?
Just because you went a couple different places and I like them all. So about the meals and the sustainability of delivered meals, that's just one of the things that's on our mind now for the future. As I mentioned, home delivered meals, the number of meals has increased during the pandemic and the need continues. So we want flexibilities, we got flexibilities, but we want them in the future. So we're seeing that as a challenge. We're looking for the flexibilities from the feds as well. So that's just one of the things that's on our mind. And can I just throw out technology because you already mentioned technology, because that really is one silver lining from this whole situation. The progress made with our use of technology will take us into the future post-COVID. I think we've all had those discussions. And the pandemic forced us to go virtual so quickly and to keep things going. We just had to do that. And it showed us that we can function remotely. And it looks like those virtual options are here to stay. So giving people access in a way that was not available before and connecting people virtually has opened up so many possibilities for engagement and participation. And while everyone may not, participate in this type of technology, we found that it really has opened up to a lot of people and offered a lot around telehealth, social isolation, and really hoping that, a lot of those things can continue.
Yeah, and I would add, it's not just technology and the access that older adults or people with disabilities have. Between all of us, right? Between for staff working, it used to be we couldn't get people to come to a meeting because they couldn't get the time out of the office and to travel. Well, now they can. So it's really, opened the gates for collaboration and for networking in a way that didn't exist before. So go ahead, Anna.
I was going to say, I think it's been interesting to see too, this really bizarre natural social experiment that we all have on our hands. It's been interesting to see which audiences we can engage better and differently. So with AARP, in moving our caregiver programming online, what we've seen is that we're getting better attendance. So we're able to really look critically at that and say, okay, so what would have barriers been in the past for the caregivers? And some of the things that you're mentioning, travel time, being away from the place where you're providing care, was more of a barrier than I think we had contemplated. But we're seeing that if you can bring that programming digitally or virtually to the place where care is happening, people want the content. So how can we keep that piece, moving forward, and also even when we're able to return to, quote unquote, normal life.
Right.
And
this is normal life right now, though. We keep waiting for it to be over. This is life right now. So, Maureen?
Yeah, I was just going to pick up where Anna left off in terms of reaching audiences, because it has been a very interesting social experiment. And kind of the flip side, working with caregivers for a moment, we've actually seen the telephonic delivery of services to be much more popular. When you look at just the population that we serve, for example, under the Connecticut statewide respite program, those families are pretty homebound. They're dealing with folks that are fairly significantly impaired. And so virtually might be difficult, but boy, telephonically, particularly with our Live Well programs, has never been more popular. There's an ability for confidentiality. There's an ability for sharing without visuals. So we've seen a definite resurgence in the Live Well programs and the ability for family caregivers who can't get out for all of those reasons that you mentioned, to dial in. And that has really been significant. And, back to Marky's point about the flexibility and things that we hope that will continue with respect to family caregivers, one of the things that has been wonderful was waiving the cap on dollar value for supplemental services. Now, those are items and services for which there really aren't any other funding sources. We know that family caregivers spend an awful lot of money out of their own pocket picking things up after work. I'm just gonna, I'll pick up a prescription here. I'm gonna pick up a lift chair. I'm gonna handle the Ensure. And supplemental services, which is the piece of the Older Americans Act Family Caregiver Program that allowed us to pay for those things, used to have a fairly restrictive cap, which we've now been able to waive as a result of the pandemic. So that's given us a lot more flexibility. We've been able to really meet families where they are and address very specific needs without having to worry about that annual cap. So that's been fantastic. And I really do commend the governor's office for recognizing and listening when advocates brought a lot of these things to their attention. So has been a huge benefit to the family caregivers in the state. And also on behalf of the area agencies on aging, one of the other things that's been really heartening for us is the ability to work across sectors and with municipalities and with other community-based organizations and philanthropy, healthcare organizations. The extent to which everybody picked up the oar was absolutely significant. I think we'd all kind of been going along either in our lanes or in our silos, whether you're vertical or horizontal. But this pandemic really allowed us and forced us out of those lanes and to build those connections. A lot of the folks that are around this Zoom, but also around the tables, represent funders like the foundations, community organizations like Salvation Army, the food banks, the community access teams. We all worked together, and hopefully that's something that we take from this. You know, we can't go back to the way we were. Because just like this commission, what happens with women, what happens with children, what happens with seniors, what happens with individuals with disabilities, people of color, we don't deserve silos and lanes. When a pandemic hits, it's everybody grab an oar. And I think that's what we've seen. And I'm hopeful that that's what we'll continue to see.
Thank you, Maureen. Julie, did you have an oar?
Yeah, I did. Following a bit on what Maureen just kind of threw out there, I think COVID has shined a really necessary light, yet another light on health equity, because our Black and Latinx population has been disproportionately hit with COVID. And so even in our world as an access agency, the community work we are doing, I think it's kind of raised it up once again as super important. And let's not forget, also in terms of, if you look at it from a policy perspective, I might sound like a broken record, but it's also shine light on the workforce, the long-term services and support workforce, and beyond that. So the folks that are working in the nursing homes, the folks that are providing our home care providers out in the trenches and beyond. And you know, Diane, I know for you what it involves on a daily basis. It's extraordinary what you're doing. And I think, again, it's somewhat unsung, unrecognized, but I do think it's starting to bubble up and people are starting to notice its value.
Yeah. So I think that we could probably take another hour.
Yeah.
We're not going to, but we could take another hour and continue this discussion without even broadening it, right, to include the long-term services and supports in congregate settings. Somebody mentioned Mairead Painter, the long-term care ombudsman, unsung hero, definitely. You know, and there's a lot of people out there that are really making things work. I think that the commission certainly is welcome and interested in doing more of these kinds of forums and bringing some of the other voices to the table. And certainly we're going to continue the work of the Age Well Collaborative that really is kind of a big tent that includes a lot of different people. Maureen mentioned funders, and there's funders, there's academia, there's providers, there's state agencies. So I think the work of aging and community in Connecticut continues post-COVID. And in some ways, I wish COVID had never happened, don't get me wrong. But in some ways, it's been a really helpful catalyst for change. But Stephen, I'm going to turn it over to you for some closing remarks. And thank you very much for this opportunity.
Well, thank you, Diane, and thank you to all the panelists. And really, instead of closing remarks, I think that this is really the promise for us to continue this conversation. If anything, what is clear to me just from hearing all of you weave together in an intersectional and sensitive way the issues of livability and really resilience that our aging population is facing in the state, it's that the biggest lesson learned is that the future of livability in this state is best seen through the lens of our aging community, because they are teaching us the importance of that resilience, the importance of our interconnectivity, the importance of multi-generational, not just programming, but also systemic work, how it is that we communicate with each other across those silos that you described, Maureen, and really create a much more attractive, livable, sustainable state for our aging population and all of our families in the state. So I love every time taking the opportunity to thank each and every one of you for all of the amazing work that you do on behalf of the residents of the state. And I'm excited to continue to working with you. Diane, I know you and I share the vision that this commission will not only continue to engage in these conversations, but will double down its own investment in having staffing on the commission that is devoted to all of these issues. So with that, I leave you and I thank you. And thank you for those of you who have been watching tonight. Take care, everybody.